right, Maggie. So I've been a man that's white for 36 years, 37 actually next week.
Wow.
And I realized just this week that I don't know what it's like to be a woman in the church. And so I this week want to know, what is it like to be a woman walking in to predominantly male dominated Christian spaces, especially as it has related to your journey in faith, but also journey through deconstruction and reconstruction?
Great question. Um, I love talking about this because I'm a really annoying feminist. So this is going to be a super fun conversation for me.
You should let everyone that's at least watching video see your shirt. Don't you have your biblical
Oh,
womanhood
I
shirt on?
do. My new favorite sweatshirt,
Yeah, it's a
Biblical
good shirt.
Womanhood. This is from Maddie May Model. She's a female theologian, a woman theologian, and she's working on her doctorate right now. And
Okay.
she's awesome, and I love her content. So
Yeah,
follow her on Instagram and
I
get one
love
of
it.
these sweet biblical womanhood shirts of Jael killing that guy in Judges 4.
I may have to get one. So, but I would be interested. So like I think about this all the time. So like I walk into Christian spaces and I typically will see a person that looks like me preaching, at least a
Mm.
man. Usually I walk into pretty white spaces and predominantly white spaces. Like I've been in churches that are uh, African American churches or more Hispanic churches, and I've had churches that are still predominantly white with pastors and preachers that aren't white. I'm a United Methodist pastor, so like there's certainly plenty of women elders and preachers in our denomination, and so like that's something that I know is more familiar, at least in my current experience. But when's the first time you saw yourself represented in leadership? I have a lot of questions for you, but when's the first time you ever saw yourself represented in leadership? And what has the journey been like as you've been going through stepping into churches? And like, are you aware of that? Like, again, I just walk in and it looks like me everywhere. So I don't have to think much about it. But I think about like if I walked into a space where I'm not represented, I think about it more. So what is that like for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I just want to say off the bat, I have a lot of things going for me demographically. So, yes, I am a woman, but I'm white, I'm heterosexual, I'm married to a man, and I have a lot going for me. So, a lot of the spaces that I'm in, even though I am a woman, I am still kind of part of the majority experience in that
Sure.
way. So, I can only kind of speak to it from this facet of being female, being a woman. And yeah, I think that the churches that I grew up in, I was taught from a very young age that women were not allowed in leadership. And this extended, if not explicitly, then implicitly into the home and other spaces as well. So even though women were not allowed to be preachers and pastors and official leaders in the church, I was also taught as a girl and as a teenager that women weren't really supposed to be the leaders of the family either, and that we were always just kind of supposed to defer to men, which was either our fathers at home or our husbands if we were married, which of course was the goal. So uh, the first time I saw a woman in leadership at a church, the thing is that a lot of churches are really weird about this, where they'll be like, women are not allowed to be pastors. Paul said so. But our leader of women's ministry and children's ministry and outreach and the secretary and all, so there's tons of women leading in church spaces. They just don't get any recognition or credit and are kind of always kept a little demoted. Of like, oh, well, you may be the leader of women's ministry, but you're not a pastor. And maybe you gave a talk to the college ministry, but it was a talk, it wasn't a sermon. Like there's all of this kind of semantic caging that I
Yeah.
experienced that kind of keeps women who are doing leadership down, which I think is very interesting and kind of brings up that like cognitive dissonance of like, women aren't supposed to lead, but we see them leading. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, that's actually a really, I think, important distinction because even in my phrasing, like I kind of imply leadership looks one specific way. And
Mm.
so certainly like there are women leading in many different perspectives. But I wrote it down what you said, like that there are women leading, and in many ways, the way you painted it, like pretty much running the church. And then
Yeah.
there's someone like speaking for 20 minutes on Sunday or 40 minutes or however long they go. But you said they don't get any recognition or credit. And I think that is certainly true. And so I like zoom it into you, and maybe you this is not a thing. So it could be a really short answer, or we could go on with it for a while. But how has that influenced how you view your role in the church? Like, are you kind of someone that looks and says, like, well, I don't deserve the credit because
Mm.
everyone that looks like me has been behind the scenes? Have you just always naturally thought, like, I don't know, like I just look at the things that you have inherited by what you've observed and how you think that might have influenced what a relationship with God looks like and what your seat at the role leading the church looks like.
Yeah, I think personality wise, I am kind of a natural leader. And that's not to say that I'm the best leader ever, but if I'm in a group of people and we're kind of directionless and trying to make a decision, I will step up and be like, okay, here are our options. Where do we want to go? Like, that's just kind of my bent. It's not something that I really worked towards. I just kind of have that quality. And I think a lot of people have that. It's usually, in my experience, appreciated a little bit more in men. But I think that since I have that proclivity, even as a kid, like I started volunteering in little leadership ways. When I was in like fourth and fifth grade, I volunteered to lead worship in Sunday school with my friends, and we would like do the motions to the songs up in front of everybody. And then in high school, I taught Sunday school to elementary schoolers and I led worship on stage. And then in college, I led a small group for middle schoolers and I led worship there too. And so I have always found ways to find something to do
Yeah.
and be a leader. Like I said earlier, I'm a really annoying feminist, and that also started really young. So
Mhm.
my I remember as a teenager, the church I went to very much taught like women are not allowed to be pastors, women are not allowed to lead. And my feeling about it was more like, okay, well, convince me then. Like, prove it because I'm looking around and I'm seeing a lot of strong female leaders. So what's the deal?
Yeah.
And I would have arguments with my youth pastor in front of everybody about why women aren't allowed to lead. That doesn't make any sense because women are leading. I'm seeing it happen and Christianity is not unraveling. So what gives, you know?
Yeah. That's interesting. Like I certainly sense that to be true in terms of like being a feminist and pushing back on this. And I would also say like I've experienced your proclivity to lead in a good way. Like I appreciate that. Like some people in a group setting, male, female, whatever, or otherwise, like some people are kind of like, tell me where to go. And other people
Mhm.
are like, we need someone to tell us where to go. And I would say you will fill that void if no one has a plan. I've noticed you'd be like, here's the plan. Has that ever got you into trouble? Like some people, they've like got their wrist slapped. Has that got you into trouble in any Christian spaces?
I haven't gotten into trouble, I don't think. I'm trying to think back. Not in a way, obviously, because now I'm having to kind of think about it. Not in a way that was really impactful, but usually, like, it would be kind of, I felt more just kind of dismissed of like,
Mm,
okay, Maggie, like, that's nice. But we're going to go ahead and do what we were planning on doing anyway. Like, it is just
yeah.
kind of a dismissive. And I have noticed too, especially in college, being a female leader in the church, you're not like thought of first as a
Mm,
leader. So I think a lot of my male peers have this kind of like inherent leadership. Like people just trust them implicitly and follow them implicitly. And I don't think that they themselves even realize that they have that power in church spaces. But and this is not true for every man in the world. Certainly not men of color or from different socioeconomic backgrounds, even because classism plays a huge role in the church too. But I think a lot of straight white men just kind of get handed leadership positions and they don't even realize that it was just handed to them. So yeah, and I've been in situations where a responsibility will be given to one of my male peers, but I'm like, wait, but I have more experience in that area, or wait, but I'm a better public speaker than they are, or I've been here longer, I've been volunteering longer. Why did you just give it to them? They just walked in, and it just kind of that feeling. So
yeah, it is like I think there's this interesting thing, and I think men are somewhat fragile, like ego wise, and somewhat might be the understatement of the year. But I remember when
just a little.
when I moved to St. Louis from Oregon, I applied for this job at this large church, like a couple thousand people, and ended up taking this job. In a retrospect, like I look back and I'm like, if I wasn't like a young married straight white dude, I wonder if I would have got the job. And like it doesn't mean like I did very well at it. And like I think in many ways like I was fit for the job. And so I'm not like questioning those things. And we don't need to go down a rabbit trail of privilege, but I think about like how that has like opened doors for me, as you said. Like I've fallen into things and like I certainly pursued this, so it's not like I like backed my way into it or accidentally fell into it. But I do think in general, if we don't ask ourselves some of those things, they become pretty easily blind spots that then we're just like, well, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, I worked hard, and everyone else that didn't, women, queer people, people of color, whatever, that are not like in the same demographic of privilege that I find myself in, like it can easily be a way to dismiss all of them as folks that just didn't work as hard as me. And it's like, well, I just probably had a few more doors open just because of the way I look, in my like circumstances. Like I know they didn't say this in my interview, at least explicitly, but like I know being a 25-year-old married pastor with a 1-year-old I was hired to do college ministry. So like you're young enough to reach college people, you have a wife and a kid, so you look mature and you can preach to the old people. And like I was a compelling hire to them, and I was a safe bet. And I've watched churches struggle to progressive and other ones to like actually let people that don't look like the people that founded their church lead it, because that's how they've kind of organized it. And so it's interesting. So one of the things you said though, and sorry for like talking about myself there for a second, but one of the things you said was you're not thought of first as a leader, and that trust is often implicit for men, and they don't like, or at least people that look like me, they don't necessarily notice that. So I wonder if you have named that as like you're not thought first of a leader as a leader, and you're not necessarily trusted implicitly. Has that had any impacts on your view of God? Because oftentimes we conceptualize God as a man. God is not that. I would pretend, but we often conceptualize God that way. And in a world that's pretty like patriarchal and male driven, like has those things or otherwise impacted how you relate with God and view God's relation to you?
I mean, I can't imagine that it hasn't, you know? And thinking back to my relationship to God as a kid, I definitely thought of God as a dad and Jesus as an older brother. And
Okay.
my little schema of them was very like traditional, kind of like middle class American archetype of what those two roles mean, of like protector, provider, um, kind of like this strong masculine leader type qualities
Yeah.
that I ascribed to God. And it wasn't until much later that I was able to see and appreciate the feminine qualities of God too, and even realize and acknowledge that God cannot really be confined by gender. That's a little bit ridiculous. I think, to
I
try
would
and
agree.
yeah. But it took me a really long time to get there. God is historically for me very masculine.
Yeah.
And so I think in though insofar as that shaped my relationship with God, I was taught from a very young age to listen to men and defer to men. And so when I would have doubts and questions or wrestle with things in my faith, especially when I was going through deconstruction, I would like picture in my mind almost being like shouted down or just like well, God is God and God is a man, so I must defer to what I'm being told. I don't know, there's this kind of like, I think what I'm getting at is just the deference of like
Yeah.
there's not a whole lot of room for debate.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a little bit what I was trying to get at, right? Like I feel again in primarily male dominated spaces, and I remember there's a pretty prominent Christian school in the St. Louis area that let my wife go due to my beliefs on queer inclusion. My wife had worked there for 15 years. They had let her go
Oh,
pretty unceremoniously. And if you've listened to this podcast long enough in our old archive of episodes, you would know what that school is. But uh, she was let go. But what was funny to me is like, so to paint the picture, my wife is a department chair PE, and she's a female, and so she realized that like she was like underpaid. Pretty common
mhm.
occurrence. Often, like women don't get paid as much as men they should be, but she realized like the entry point for men was just higher. So she went to like go advocate for a higher salary. They seemed to be fine with it. She brought up uh, the theology of the well, and I just want to make sure you guys know this. They let her go in a 15-minute conversation that she wasn't even a part of after putting it 15 years into the school.
Oh my God.
And what's crazier is that was hired by that school. I was known as a pastor, and I sat down with the head of school longer than he took to decide to let my wife go. And we talked about theology and church and all this. And he just assumed because
Mhm.
I was a guy and a pastor that I was his kind of pastor,
Mm,
like theologically. And so he didn't question me. So he gave me a level of like respect and grace and kind of assumption that he didn't give this person that was like pretty long held and tenured position and an integral part of the community. And I have to suspect if she was a man in that role, it would have gone differently. But
yeah.
because she was a woman, it went one way. And it's just interesting to me because it's like I walk into spaces, I disagreed with this dude on everything, and I like didn't like hide anything about who I was, but because I was a man, I got a longer leash to disagree because we were like doing theological boxing or whatever, right? And for
Mhm.
him, he's like, well, she's just like a weak woman. We're gonna let her go. I'm like editorializing his thoughts a little bit, but it's just like I look at those stories and I'm like, that's unfair.
Yeah.
Um, and then I wonder like how much that happens. And this is me like truly asking this, like how much I maybe do that because I've built in mechanisms into my own life where like I just live in this way that I don't realize it. And it's just become second nature. So I'm always trying to unlearn that. But then I go to the other side, like how much does my wife or how much do you or how much do my other friends at the church and otherwise like have to go through this? And like I'm just like I'm living this life breezy and living and having joy. And I'm like, everyone else is just like fighting for their life to be valued.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of it is just kind of like the water that we swim in. And so even men that are not overtly sexist, like if I asked, a lot of my former pastors, if I said, "Do you think that women are worse than men?" They wouldn't say, "Yes, I do." Like that's that's not like
Yeah.
a firmly held overt belief that a lot of people hold.
Yeah.
But I think that, especially in the church, the way that we teach the Bible to people reinforces
Hmm.
the patriarchy and reinforces male supremacy in a way that is really hard to identify if you are benefiting from it. So I have a couple of examples of like Bible characters that have really stood out to me in the way that they're taught and talked about.
Yeah.
One that came to mind was David, King David, who committed numerous sins and like really caused damage and hurt to people. But in the story, but David is always taught to people as a man after God's own heart. King David was a man after God's own heart. And so it doesn't matter that he assaulted Bathsheba and killed her husband.
Yeah.
Bathsheba shouldn't have been bathing on the roof. She was seducing him, even though that was the uh, only way at the time that she could have been, clean during her menstrual cycle and ritually clean and all of this stuff. And not to mention that he was the king and that she was a subject and had no choice in the matter. When the king's guards come to your house and say, come to the palace, you go. So it's just a lot of framing of women as harlots
Yeah.
and men as these stalwarts of the faith that are then seduced by wicked women, like King David was by Bathsheba. Or another example is Rahab, who was taught to me until college as a liar and a prostitute, someone
Yeah.
who debased herself and lied and was deceitful and dishonest. But viewing that story through a feminist lens, she was doing what she needed to do to survive and to take care of her family, and then she saved these soldiers that were, sent by the Lord. She became this integral piece of God's
Yeah.
story. But if you teach it from the perspective that Rahab is a villain and a whore, to use kind of
Yeah.
a dirty, inflammatory word, then like what message is that sending to young girls in the congregation and young men? If we talk about all of these fallen women in the Bible, and even though male characters like David, like Abraham, like Saul, they commit these atrocities against other people, but are propped up as heroes of the faith. Like, what message is that sending to the people in your congregation?
Yeah. Yeah. And I even was struck by what you said. Like, and I was just thinking about this, and I don't even know if this is right. Like, I'm baking this idea, but like, I don't even know if that's feminist theology. That's just
Mm.
like good theology in terms of like viewing her story the way it should be read. And I think like the way that it was intended to be read, like it was written in a patriarchal society, and like we have since been further steeped in that, and so it's easy for us. And part of the reason we read David the way we read it is because it is an amazing story of redemption, but it's also a protective story for abusive and manipulative men. And so it's
Mhm.
like it's been used. I love it. It's a great story, but it's also been used too many times as a way to be like, well, you're still a man after God's own heart after that atrocious act. And then I think what makes it more problematic is not like, because I'm like, I mean, you know me well enough that I'm like, I think God's grace is for everybody. And so, like, I have a
Mhm.
hard time drawing a line anywhere. So the issue is not, for me at least, David getting grace. It is how it is often juxtaposed to these other stories of women who aren't like, they're almost analogous stories, but they are not given the same level. We never talk about a woman after God's own heart. We never talk about these heroes of the faith that are women that are doing pretty similar things.
Mhm.
And again, like think if we talked about biblical womanhood, like think about if Jael was a man, like how is
Mhm.
that story differently represented if it's a man doing that? And Rahab and all these other stories. And even like my wife and I, like we love the story of Esther and Ruth.
Mhm.
And like I wonder how those stories become different if they're not like hyper feminized. And like is that why we love that story? Like I don't know, but like I just like there's a lot of things that we certainly don't have time in a 40-minute podcast to untangle. But I do think it is a question that the church, or are questions that the church is not critically asked enough, or at least in the congregation. Like one of the things that I appreciate is like in seminary, I got to ask hard questions.
Mhm.
And a lot of people that went to seminary do their congregations a disservice by presenting things as facts instead of conversations. And what we don't ever tell anyone is like in seminary, they're all conversations.
Mhm.
That's how we learn them. And like these aren't like we're reading static facts out of a static book, but we're opening conversations that require deep questions and often open up more questions. But then when we get into the pulpit, all these seminary trained people or unseminary trained people, depending on your upbringing, like they're just like, well, the Bible says it, that settles it. This is fact. And like that is how things like what you said, I think, are perpetuated. And I think part of the issue is like the way we're addressing these stories is wrong from like a perspective of patriarchy and feminism, but also in terms of like treating them as static stories rather than conversations about the human experience.
Yeah. And I think we really can't discount the fact that the church, like the capital C American church, is a patriarchy, but so is American culture. And
Yeah.
so even if you're not listening to a pastor preach a story from a pulpit with through a certain lens and taking that as fact, a lot of churches also kind of promote the like sola scriptura method of reading the Bible or whatever, where it's like God's word alone, you know?
Yeah.
But what that completely ignores is that if we're reading the Bible as individuals, we are painting our own cultural experience and life experience on top of that. So, for example, I was always taught the stories of Esther and Ruth almost like these Disney princess stories of like
Yeah.
women that found their husbands and like
Yeah. Right.
they're these love stories. Um, and that's very cultural too. That's very in the water that we swim in. And so if I were
Mm.
just like, okay, well, my pastor said that, like Ruth's story is all about how she found her husband, but I don't think that's true. I'm going to read the Bible for myself. Like, I'm still bringing in all of this patriarchal ideology. And so I could maybe read the story for myself and come to the exact same conclusion, which is why I think a conversation is really important to your point. But even more than that, a conversation that involves women, men, people of color, people from different sexualities and socioeconomic backgrounds. Like we have to have a diverse conversations about these things because that's how we can understand it more wholly.
Yeah. On a funny side note, we were talking about Ruth at dinner last night as
Mm-hmm.
proof that we do actually talk about the Bible outside of church in my family. But my daughter was at the table and we're talking about Ruth, and she's like, "Are you guys talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg right now?" And so she was very confused. She's like, I think you guys don't know who you're talking about." And she's 9. And so I was like, I love that you know this much about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but not about Ruth
Yes.
of the Bible. And it was just very funny. She's like, I don't think you guys know who you're talking about.
Honestly, two very important roots for your daughter to know about.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Ruths have been rocking it since the beginning of time.
Yep.
So this isn't exactly connected to the topic, but this did come up again, another conversation Annie, my wife, and I were having. I can't remember what sparked it. Like maybe we were listening to a worship song and it like came on, or
Hmm.
we certainly talking about it to some degree, but I can't remember what catalyzed the conversation. But we got talking about like those early 2000s songs. Oh no, I think I was like listening to like a really old, not old, like an early 2000s worship song. And I was like, I like
Yeah.
love these songs. And we started talking about whatever that song is that like has the crescendo line of the sloppy wet kiss. Do you know that?
Ah, yes.
Yeah. Or
Yeah, totally.
which
How he
then
loves.
yeah, how he loves, and they
Yeah.
changed it to like unforeseen kiss, which is like even more problematic in some ways.
Mhm.
But they're like, we want to like make it not sloppy, so then we'll make it like secretive and whatever. So
Yeah.
one of the things that like I didn't like, I didn't think, partially because there was like homophobia in the church, but I didn't think of Jesus as like my boyfriend, right? So it's like guys never really had that framework.
Yeah.
But women like had this like Jesus is my boyfriend, and like it was very sexualized, and I'm dating, and like for me, if I was dating anyone, it was my future bride, the church, right? Like I was a part of that, but I got to be the husband and the church was my bride. And for you though, like what like was your religious experience like oddly sexualized, and like what was that like in terms of that? Because I know worship in the early thousands bent that way a little bit, but like I just remember like this boy, like there was Jesus is my homeboy was like the boy version of it, but I do remember girls being like, I'm like dating Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. We can't really have this conversation without talking about purity culture too,
Yes.
which is my number one op. I hate purity culture. I was joking with some friends about it a couple nights ago because sometimes all you can do is laugh. But we were talking, anyways, some friends that are kind of former Catholics, and then I, as this kind of coming up in the Reformed Protestant, whatever. And we were making all these jokes of like, hey girl, are you a chewed up piece of gum? Because no one is going to want to put you in their mouth. And like that kind of, because those like purity culture metaphors, like, hey girl,
Right.
are you a crumpled up piece of paper? Because no matter how much you try to straighten it out, it'll never be the same. Like that,
Yeah.
those methods of like having, those are about like talking about premarital sex and how
Yeah.
it somehow fundamentally changes you as a person and makes you unlovable. But like as a woman growing up in that environment, yeah, your relationship with Jesus, I wouldn't say is sexualized because that would have been so taboo, but like very romanticized for
Mm.
sure. Like
Yeah.
Jesus is your boyfriend, Jesus is your prince, your knight in shining armor, like very it was just really objectifying. Like I think I
Yeah.
grew up seeing myself as just kind of an instrument or like an object
Mm.
in the larger picture of the church. So not necessarily like a driving force of anything, but definitely more passive, like you're either being led by your father or Jesus, who is a boy, or your husband. And they're the ones doing the leading, and you're the one doing the following and the submitting. And um yeah, very, yeah, so not sexual, but like romantic for sure in a weird way.
Yeah. The chewing gum one's a nightmare. I do think about that one, like, and I don't know if this was presented to you, but like even talking more about like doubling down on like the bad stereotypes of it, like the way it was presented to me is like the guys were the chewers and the women were the gum. And like
Yes.
so it was different problems, right? So like the guys like, well, you're just gonna have all these flavors in your mouth. And like it's not gonna be as good. And then for the women, it was like, well, you're gonna like be chewed up and like all it was just
Uh-huh.
like what a just jacked up way to go. And I remember I grew up in public school, and so like I didn't go to Christian school, but I remember like someone from like some religious group came to talk to us about abstinence and premarital sex, and they did like the tape on the hand. Did you ever do that one? So like
Yeah.
they pull it
Yep.
off, and so by the end it's like foggy, and it's like this is what it's like if you have 10 sexual partners, and you can't even see through this piece of tape. And I'm like, what are we talking about here? But I
What's
remember
going
like
on?
just like
Yeah.
putting tape on and off my hand. I was like, I guess I shouldn't have sex because I'm gonna like look like this piece of tape. Like it's just like
Yeah.
it's all of the bad tropes. Like I think it's like my kids are going. I have a fifth grader and a fourth grader and a kindergartner, but my older ones, they have a curriculum right now in like sex ed in fourth and fifth grade, which I
Mhm.
personally think is like a little early. But I like the conversations I'm looking because I get to see all the curriculum and the questions they're asking. I'm like, they're not at least getting like this same level of shame about it that I'm getting. I appreciate that. I think
Yeah.
my kids are potentially overinformed, which I am reconciling with what I think about that. But at least they're not like shamed about it. And so I'm interested to see how they grow up in a world that now they have, again, as we talked about on the last step, like they have access to information.
Yeah.
Uh, and so it's different, the
Mhm.
conversation is different than it was, at least when I was a kid.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and in the church too, it is this very weird transition from like you're a child and then suddenly you're all kind of going through puberty and you're in like middle school ministry or youth ministry or whatever, and then like once a quarter you're talking about sexual purity. Like it's a
Yeah.
very kind of jarring transition. And I think purity culture does a disservice to men and women,
Yeah.
and everybody of every gender identity is harmed by purity culture because it's harmful and nasty. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's hard because it's like heterosexual people are harmed, men and women alike. Queer people are harmed,
Hmm.
like men and women alike. Non-binary, trans, like it's like so reductive that it's like you can't be any human in this
Yeah.
conversation. And I remember like youth group leaders that were like talking about their like these are like 20-year-olds, like these weren't even like adults, and they're like talking about their confessing their sins to us. And like I remember like a young 20 somethings couple was like talking to us, they were married, but about like their sexual problems and how they like waited
Yeah.
till they were married, and then it was like they had all these issues, and I'm like 15, and I'm like,
Yeah.
what are we talking about right now? Like it was just like a lot to process. And I was like not a like prude, sheltered kid, but I
Mhm.
was like I was like, I don't need to know about your guys' sex life. But now as a 37-year-old man, as like a pastor of a church, I'm like, I would shudder at the idea that we were putting like our 21-year-old leaders up and like, hey, you know what we should do this week at youth group is talk about your failed sexual encounters with this group of 13-year-olds. Like that's
Right.
crazy to me.
Yes. People who are so young and also have been married for like 5 seconds and are giving children, minors, advice about sex. That's very borders on grooming behavior, and I don't like that at all. That's very nasty.
This is funny, like laugh so you don't cry funny, but it is also a
Yeah.
little bit funny. But I do remember I was listening to a TikTok about this. It was like a 21-year-old couple that got married. They waited till their wedding night to have sex, presumably. But they went up to like go talk about this. But then they had talked about how they were like nervous about the mechanics of it. And
Uh-huh.
so like they, with God's permission, like months before the wedding started like trying things, and it was
Yes.
like it like just like melted, and I'm like, this is what happens when you put
Mhm.
21-year-olds up. And like I'm like, I wouldn't shame this couple, like I think whatever, but it was just like the coalescing of a lot of crazy that came to be in this moment. And I'm like, no wonder this thing blew up in everyone's faces. And I think the way the story ends is like this whole conference like got shut down, but this workshop was like they got pulled off the stage, like we're not doing this
Yeah.
anymore. And I'm like, no wonder.
Yeah. No, I think I've heard that same story. And yeah, I'm just like, wow, God love them. Like they,
Yeah.
you know.
And I can't blame like the 21 and 20 or 21-year-olds because it's
Right.
like they were given no guardrails. And like in
Right.
really evangelical and kind of fundamentalist specifically places that are like pretty purity culture wise, like the moment you're 18, especially as a man, you're like are given this like adulthood, which I'm like, that's great,
Mhm.
treat people like adults. But once you're married, it's like you've crossed this threshold of like you've arrived as a Christian couple. And so it's like, well, now we're going to throw them up because they're a great example of good Christian marriage. And then like, oh yeah, they're just like kids figuring this
Yeah.
out and like they're learning. And there should be grace in that, but it's like to put them up as the authority figure. Like I'm been married for a while. I did loved it so much I decided to do it twice. Like I've been a bachelor. So it's like but I don't know that like if I sit up and did a conversation on marriage that like I would feel like I had every answer, even though I'm 36, 37 almost, and like I've been married and I have kids, and like I think that's crazy that we put
Mhm.
people up and say like, hey, they have all the answers for you.
Yeah. Marriage is also this very strange, like, uh, thing. I don't know the word I'm looking for. Marriage is also this very convention of the church, I suppose.
Yeah.
That's like, which I think marriage is important. I'm not one of those that's like, oh, marriage doesn't matter, it's just a piece of paper. I'm like, no, like you're making a commitment to somebody, and that promise is very important. But it is marriage in my Christian upbringing was at once the most important thing in a person's life and also trivialized to the point that they would have like 19-year-olds who had been married for 2 months lead a conference on,
Yeah.
like marriage or whatever. Like it very, and also like, uh, I think purity, like sexual purity, was prized so highly that people would get married really young and really fast.
Yeah.
And no adults in their lives were really guarding or protecting them against that.
Mm.
And kind of warning against, like, this isn't just a physical relationship. Like, you are committing to be with this person, to have children with this person, to be with them for the rest of your life in a romantic relationship. Are you sure? And that piece never really seemed to be like fully talked through with a lot of very young couples. So people that would get married like right after high school or in college. It
Yeah.
was always seen as this like great thing of like, oh, that's amazing. Like they're following God's call on their life to stay pure and to commit and do all of this stuff. And for some people it worked out and that's great. And they're still married and like, peace and blessings. But some people, they wind up being divorced pretty young and having to go through a lot of like heartbreak and hardship that maybe could have been avoided if they had just waited a little longer.
Well, that's certainly the case for me. I would say like
Yeah.
it is interesting. Like I found myself like kind of in funny ways in conversations a lot with people where they're like, oh, I was married at like 21 and got divorced or whatever. And like, that's so young
Mhm.
and so stupid. And I was like, well, I was married at 21. So but it is interesting. Like, I went to a Christian college and it wasn't like a hyper fundamentalist Christian college. It just had like it was founded as a Christian college. They had a Christian ministries department, a biblical studies department, but it wasn't like everyone there was like hyper Christian nerd.
Mhm.
And it was like everyone was like a homeschooler or something, though we certainly
Yeah,
had a lot of those kids, and no shame on homeschoolers for sure.
for sure.
Uh, but I remember there was this like pressure to get married early. I know that like the joke at my Christian college was women were trying to get their ring by spring. And like that was like a whole
Yeah.
thing. And also the moment I knew I was going to be a pastor, which was around my like late sophomore, junior, early junior year, then I felt this clock of like getting married. And it felt like there was like to be a pastor, I had to have a wife, and to be the best Christian, like I had to embody, again, going back to like this the bride was the church, but I needed like a bride in my life. And I didn't like ever subscribe to this idea that like I was this like domineering head of the household by any means, but I did see myself conforming to a lot of like expectations that really sped up my process of things that maybe if I wasn't religious, I wouldn't have done in that time. And again, 10 years later, I ended up getting a divorce, and like I have two wonderful kids out of it. And like I'm excited to I was talking to someone the other, like I wouldn't change anything about my
Mm.
life. Like I think I'm happy to be where I am. Certainly a lot of like pain and heartache that I went through that I would love to have not experienced and not done again. But it like I look at all of that as not a I wouldn't blame my divorce on the participants of my marriage as much as I would blame it on the societal pressures of religion that forced me into
Mhm.
something that I probably wasn't, as you said, like emotionally mature enough. And I was like checking a box that seemed right. And then like it came 10 years later, slapping me in the face, being like, well, obviously this wasn't right. But like there were a lot of pressures that pushed me that way. And like it is just interesting, and I don't shame anyone for getting married early, but I
Mhm.
certainly caution whenever I'm meeting with someone that I'm like, "Let's think about this." And, like, I've done a lot of weddings as a pastor. I've never told anyone not to get married, but I have always encouraged people, like, what is the motivation? Like, is this because you were told you wanted to or because you're really interested in this? And I've met with people, I've not officiated these weddings, but people that are like, "I'm just ready to have sex." I'm like, "That's the wrong reason to get
Yeah.
married." Like, that's a bad reason to get married.
Yeah, it is a bad reason to get married. Yeah, I haven't been married for that long in the grand scheme of things. I've been married for almost 4 years,
Okay.
and I got married when I was 25, and just because of the, like, Christian subculture that I was a part of, which I went to Mizzou, so, like, not a tiny little Christian school, but
Yeah.
I was a part of this, like, Christian subculture. I felt like an ancient decrepit crone because I was not engaged by 22. Like, I was like, "I'm a
Okay.
spinster and no one will ever love me." And then I kind of got out of that a little bit, and now I'm 29 and I've been married for a couple years, and I'm like, "Oh my god, getting married at 25? It was so young." Like, I was like,
Yeah.
and I'm only a couple years out, and so
But you felt some of that same pressure? Like, you did feel like some of like because you weren't married by 21, you maybe felt like, I felt the pressure, but you felt like, "Man, I'm, like, wasting my prime years." Like, is
yeah,
that
yes, I was very like, what's wrong with me? All of my friends are getting married the spring after we graduate undergrad, like, undergrad,
Yeah.
college. And it almost felt like a failure that I like didn't have that ring by spring and
Yeah.
didn't have that like good Christian boyfriend that was gonna propose and we were gonna have a good Christian wedding where we washed each other's feet and stuff. No hate to people who wash each other's feet during wedding ceremonies, but
That's funny. Can I tell you the first wedding I ever did? And I
yeah.
hope they listen to this podcast. It was my favorite wedding, and I actually don't know that they fully knew it was my first wedding ever. And I think if they did, they might have been like, "We want someone else." But it was so fun. And, like I've stayed in contact with this couple. They live in the Northwest now, and like
Mm-hmm.
they're super fun. But they were Catholic, and so we did a lot of things to like appease their Catholic family. They were not personally Catholic, but we did a lot of things, and so it was to date the longest wedding I've ever officiated, probably closer to 40 minutes. Most of mine are like 20 minutes all in, if that, maybe 15 or less. Um, but they really wanted to wash feet and do communion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they were like, well, we want to wash feet first so we can like get ourselves ready, and then we want to do communion. And we talked through the logistics, and they wanted to serve everyone communion. And I'm like, do you know that everyone's going to be feeling like they're eating your feet
Yeah, like
if
you
you guys
just
do
touched
this?
each other's feet.
Yeah. So we had to like work out the logistics of that. And so we moved some things around so it wasn't like that. But like those are funny things when I think about like what we want out of this church experience and our
Mm-hmm.
wedding experience. And we think about everything in like the vacuum of our own desire or experience. I'm like, but here's how everyone else will experience. They're gonna be like, I'm gonna get like athlete's mouth by eating your like foot. It's gross. So
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I know the on the one hand, I've been to weddings where the bride and groom wash each other's feet. And in a vacuum, I'm like, this is a symbol of your commitment to serving one another and humility and all of that. And in a vacuum, it's very beautiful. But in real life, I'm looking at your feet and I feel weird.
yeah,
So that's not a choice that I made for my personal wedding. If it's
yeah.
something that's very important to someone listening, that's
We're
great.
glad you did it. Yeah,
I'm
I think
glad you
it's a great sign of mutual submission. And
did.
like it
Mhm.
is an interesting thing that like out of the context of church, like if you're not like I can tell you the kind of people that typically do that kind of stuff, like the Christian tradition they're probably from, and I think it's really cool. But I'm also like I always push back a little bit against like hyper religious tropes and rites because I want to like not do them just because everyone did them. Like do you like I was married in my first marriage in the time of like two really popular things. There was like the candle you made together or the
Mhm.
cord of three, where you like weave this like cord and it's an unbreakable thing. Those are like really popular things that were happening in weddings. Um, and there was a wedding I went to where they ended up getting divorced, but they did a unity candle and they spent 5 minutes trying to get this thing to light and it wouldn't light. And now it's like a very funny joke to be like, well, obviously God didn't want this thing.
Obviously, it was a sign from the
Yeah,
Lord.
which
Yeah.
I don't think it was, but it's funny to like look back at it. So, well, we're getting close to an hour. So I want to wind
Yeah.
us down. So I do want to know, like, in a sentence, what's it like being a woman in the church these days?
One sentence. Um, it is complicated and hurtful and sad sometimes, but it can also be really beautiful because even though a lot of the patriarchal values of the church are meant to subjugate and objectify women, that is not the way that God sees us or the way that it has to be.
Yeah.
That was my really long run on sentence for you.
Hey, I dig it. Don't let a man tell you what you can do. You do whatever you
You know
want to do.
what?
So
You're so right. You can't tell me what to do, Danny.
you do. You can do a paragraph if you want, but not because I gave you permission.
I'm going to
Uh,
do a paragraph, but not because you told me to.
yeah, I I really appreciate this conversation. Like we talked a little about Enneagram. I can't remember if on this episode or last one, but
The last one.
I dig opportunities. Self exploration is like one of my favorite things, but also, and this is what makes Enneagram eights maybe a little different. So I know not everyone feels this way, but I love exploring like my blind spots and weak spots, and like things like this are some of my favorite conversations because I find it points me towards like greater awareness and illumination. And so I appreciate you like sharing this. I know like you don't speak for all women, you don't have all the answers, but I do appreciate you sharing your perspective. And for any women listening, I hope like they feel affirmed and seen and heard. But I hope for like any guys listening, like maybe taking some challenge to be like, you know what? Like I walk into most spaces, especially if you're a straight white guy like me, and there's just very little about you that has to be questioned. And
Mm.
trying to figure out like, well, then how do we create space for queer people or women or people of color, anyone that is traditionally marginalized in like the predominantly white spaces and predominantly straight male spaces of church. And certainly there's black churches and there's more female centric churches and there's more queer centric persons. But we know what I mean. We mean by that, like the church for a long time has been dominated by people that look like me. And so realizing, I think, how to like open up those spaces to make it feel more like this community that I think Jesus was actually trying to build, and less of one that feels like the awkward family dinner where you're like trying not to say something to piss off like the abusive uncle or whatever.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times these conversations can feel like I'm attacking men because I'm like, you're subjugating me and like all of this stuff. And then the men who are friends with me are like, no, I'm not. You're literally my friend. Like, and so that is not the vibe at all.
Yeah.
It's more of like, I always want these conversations to be shaped more like a call in of like, hey, let's take a second to look around together and see how the patriarchy has shaped the church and see how that is harmful to women and non-binary folks and basically everybody who isn't a man. Let's take a second to look around and acknowledge that most people in this space, especially in leadership, look like you. And I think that there is a certain level of humility that men in this scenario have to recognize that and to like kind of do the self exploration to get to the bottom of why that's bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. Like, this has been a fun conversation.
Yeah.
I am enjoying these conversations, and I'm excited to dive back in and see what question you have as we do this again next week.
Yeah. Woo. Can't wait.